Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to thank each and every one of you who supports this channel. I put a lot of effort into creating these stories for you, stories that help us reflect, imagine, and remember. If you enjoy what you hear, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Your support truly helps this channel grow and motivates me to keep going. Now settle in, let your mind drift into the shadows of history, and let's begin. When we speak of Soviet prisons, many imagine endless Siberian camps, barbed wire, and bitter cold. Yet the roots of this system reach further back into the final years of the Russian Empire. Before the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the empire already maintained a vast network of prisons, exile settlements, and penal colonies. Dissidents, revolutionaries, and criminals alike were scattered across distant provinces, often sent thousands of kilometers away from home. The Bolshevik Revolution promised freedom and justice for the oppressed. But soon after consolidating power, Lenin's government began to build a system of confinement far harsher and more organized than the Tsarist one. In 1918, the first concentration camps appeared, officially designed to hold class enemies, former nobles, wealthy merchants, priests, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. What was meant to be a temporary measure quickly became a permanent institution. Prisons in the early Soviet years were chaotic. Food was scarce, guards often brutal, and the line between political prisoner and criminal was deliberately blurred. A person could be arrested for belonging to the wrong social group, for telling a joke about the government, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. These were years of civil war, famine, and political terror, and prisons became both a symbol and a tool of the new regime. The Soviet state quickly realized that prisons could serve a dual purpose, punishment and labor. Instead of keeping inmates idle, authorities forced them into work, cutting timber, building railroads, digging canals. The foundations of what later became the infamous Gulag system were already being laid. In the 1920s, the government spoke of re-education. Officially, prisons were not meant to destroy people, but to reshape them into new Soviet citizens. Yet in reality, conditions were brutal. Disease spread easily, overcrowding was constant, and hunger gnawed at every inmate. Many never left alive. This was the dawn of a dark era. The prison system was no longer just a place for thieves and murderers. It became a machine capable of swallowing anyone. Worker, farmer, intellectual, or soldier. The empire of prisons was being born. By the late 1920s, the Soviet Union stood at the edge of transformation. Joseph Stalin had consolidated power, and with his vision of rapid industrialization came the need for massive labor. Prisons, once chaotic and loosely organized, were reshaped into a vast network of camps that would serve the state's ambitions. This system would become infamous under one name: the Gulag. The Gulag was not a single place, but a sprawling empire of camps scattered across the Soviet Union. From the frozen tundra of Kolyma to the dense forests of Karelia, camps appeared wherever labor was needed. The purpose was not only punishment, it was production. Prisoners mined gold, felled timber, built dams, and laid railways across some of the most inhospitable land on Earth. At first glance, the idea seemed efficient. The Soviet state gained cheap labor. Prisoners, at least in theory, were given food, shelter, and the possibility of re-education through work. In practice, it was a machine of suffering. Conditions were brutal. Winters dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Workdays stretched from dawn to night, with little rest. Rations were tied to performance. If a prisoner failed to meet a quota, their food was cut, weakening them further in a deadly spiral. The 1930s brought the Great Purge, and with it, the Gulag expanded on an unprecedented scale. Political prisoners flooded the camps. Party officials accused of disloyalty. Officers branded as spies. Intellectuals suspected of sabotage. Entire families could vanish overnight, swallowed by arrests that often came without explanation. A knock at the door after midnight became a symbol of terror. Inside the camps, survival became an art. Some clung to scraps of human dignity, teaching each other poetry, whispering prayers, or recording memories in hidden notebooks. Others hardened themselves, turning ruthless in order to survive. Violence between prisoners was common, often encouraged by guards as a method of control. The Gulag was more than just a prison. It was an engine of fear that reached far beyond the barbed wire. People outside the camps lived in constant uncertainty, aware that one accusation could doom them to the same fate. And yet, the Gulag also became a paradox. It helped build the Soviet Union's infrastructure, while at the same time consuming millions of lives in the process. By the end of Stalin's rule, the Gulag held millions of inmates. Some were hardened criminals. Many were innocents. All were trapped in a system that blurred the line between justice and terror. To understand the Soviet Union, one must understand the Gulag, a place where ideology, power, and cruelty converged. To imagine life inside a Soviet prison or camp, one must set aside all notions of comfort. These were not places of rehabilitation in the Western sense, nor were they temporary punishments designed to pass quickly. They were worlds of their own, self-contained societies, where every hour was shaped by hunger, exhaustion, and the constant pressure of survival. Days began early, often before sunrise. Prisoners were woken by the harsh sound of whistles or the barking of guards. Work brigades were assembled, counted, and marched out under armed watch. In the harsh northern camps, men trudged through deep snow with axes and saws, while in Central Asia, others worked under the scorching sun, digging canals or constructing factories. Work was endless, and quotas had to be met. Food was the currency of life. A prisoner's daily ration, usually a piece of black bread, a thin soup of cabbage or millet, and sometimes a spoonful of porridge, depended directly on labor output. Fail to meet the norm, and your ration was cut. For many, this system became a death sentence. Malnutrition weakened the body, and once a prisoner slipped below a certain point, recovery was rare. Men and women alike wasted away, their strength consumed long before their sentences ended. Disease was rampant. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and frostbite claimed countless lives. Medical care was minimal, often limited to crude bandages or aspirin if supplies were available at all. In many cases, the sick were left to die, their places quickly filled by new arrivals. But perhaps the greatest challenge was not the labor or the hunger. It was the slow erosion of the human spirit. Days blurred into months, months into years. For political prisoners, who often considered themselves innocent, the psychological toll was immense. Many clung to hope through memory, recalling their families, silently reciting poetry, or carving tiny keepsakes out of wood or stone. And yet, even in such conditions, moments of resilience shone through. secret networks of solidarity emerged. Prisoners shared stolen scraps of food, whispered forbidden songs, or taught each other languages and mathematics in hushed voices after lights out. For some, learning and memory became acts of quiet defiance, proof that the state could not completely strip them of identity. For others, survival required ruthless pragmatism. Some aligned themselves with criminals for protection. Others learned to trade, using anything from buttons to scraps of tobacco as currency. In this shadow economy, a pair of warm boots or a needle and thread could mean the difference between life and death. Life behind bars was more than physical suffering. It was a constant test of endurance, a balancing act between body and spirit. For every story of despair, there was another of remarkable survival, proof that even in the harshest of systems, humanity could not be entirely extinguished. Inside the Soviet prison world, there existed not only guards and inmates, but entire social systems with their own rules, hierarchies, and codes of conduct. To survive, one had to understand this hidden order, for it shaped every interaction behind the walls. At the top of the inmate society were the so-called thieves in law, professional criminals who lived according to their own strict code. They rejected all cooperation with the state, despised work, and ruled through fear, charisma, and loyalty to their brotherhood. To cross them meant punishment, often brutal and final. These criminals developed a unique language, a mixture of slang, symbols, and tattoos that served as both identity and protection. Tattoos in particular became a visual autobiography, marking crimes committed, time served, and allegiance to the underworld. The star inked on the shoulders signified authority. A cathedral with domes represented the number of prison terms endured. For the uninitiated, the tattoos were cryptic, but for those inside, they spoke volumes. Ordinary prisoners, especially political ones, often found themselves caught between these hardened criminals and the camp authorities. Guards frequently manipulated these divisions, pitting one group against another to maintain control. Political inmates, who might have been teachers, engineers, or writers in their former lives, were often at the bottom of this hierarchy. They lacked the street wisdom of the criminals and were easy prey for exploitation. Yet not all power belonged to the thieves. Over time, the Soviet authorities tried to weaken their dominance by promoting so-called trustees, prisoners who cooperated with camp officials. These men were given lighter work, better rations, and some authority over their fellow inmates. But this privilege came at a cost. They were despised by both criminals and political prisoners, often living in constant fear of revenge. Conflict between these groups shaped daily life. Alliances could shift overnight, and violence was never far away. Knives fashioned from scrap metal, fists hardened by labor, and sudden ambushes in dark barracks kept the atmosphere tense. Every prisoner had to learn quickly where he stood in the invisible order of the camp. Still, within this brutal society, codes of honor and unspoken rules existed. Sharing a crust of bread, giving up a blanket, or teaching a fellow prisoner how to endure questioning by guards could build bonds of trust. In a place designed to strip away individuality, these small acts of solidarity became powerful reminders of humanity. The prison hierarchy was a mirror of the larger Soviet world outside, a system of power, fear, and survival. And just like in society beyond the barbed wire, to live meant to adapt, to navigate shifting rules, and to carry on under constant watch. Behind the walls of Soviet prisons lived millions of nameless souls whose stories were never told. Yet among them were voices that survived, voices that managed to escape the silence and speak to the world. Through their testimonies, we glimpse not only the suffering, but also the resilience of the human spirit. One of the most famous was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a decorated officer during the Second World War. Arrested in 1945 for criticizing Stalin in a private letter, he was sentenced to years in the camps. There, he endured forced labor, illness, and the crushing reality of the Gulag. Yet out of this darkness came words that would one day shake the Soviet system itself. His masterpiece, The Gulag Archipelago, documented the machinery of repression with unflinching honesty. For this work, Solzhenitsyn was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, though he lived much of his life in exile. His writings transformed personal suffering into universal testimony. Another voice was that of Varlam Shalamov, whose Kolyma tales revealed the horror of one of the harshest regions of the Gulag. Kolyma, in the far northeast, was known as a land of gold and death. Temperatures could fall below -50, and survival depended on sheer luck as much as strength. Shalamov spent nearly 2 decades there, enduring near starvation, brutal labor, and constant illness. His stories are stripped of sentimentality, showing life in the camps as it was, raw, merciless, and often devoid of hope. Yet by writing them, Shalamov preserved memory against oblivion. Not all stories were of writers. Countless intellectuals, scientists, and artists passed through the prison gates. The brilliant engineer Sergei Korolev, who would later become the father of the Soviet space program, was once a prisoner. Accused of sabotage, he nearly perished in the camps, weakened by hunger and illness. Released just in time, Korolev went on to design the rockets that would carry the first satellites and eventually the first human into space. His survival changed the course of history. There were also the silent martyrs, remembered only through fragments of records or whispered memory. Priests who refused to renounce their faith, farmers who resisted collectivization, mothers who wrote secret letters to children they would never see again. Each of them carried a story of endurance, whether or not it was ever told. These testimonies reveal a paradox. The prison system was designed to break the individual, to erase personality, and to enforce silence. Yet out of that silence rose some of the strongest voices of the 20th century. By enduring, by remembering, and by telling their truth, these prisoners defeated the system in the only way possible, by ensuring it could not be forgotten. When Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. His death triggered a wave of political change, and with it came a shift in the prison system. The Gulag, which had once been the backbone of Stalin's rule, began to shrink. Millions of prisoners were released during the so-called thaw, led by Nikita Khrushchev. Camps closed, sentences were reduced, and the era of mass terror gradually faded. But the Soviet prison system did not disappear. Instead, it evolved. The most brutal excesses of Stalin's years were curbed, yet the state still relied heavily on imprisonment as a tool of control. During the 1960s and 70s, new categories of prisoners emerged, not only criminals, but also dissidents, writers, activists, and ordinary citizens who dared to question official ideology found themselves behind bars. Instead of sprawling labor camps, many were sent to smaller prisons, psychiatric hospitals, or internal exile. The nature of repression changed, but its purpose remained the same: to silence opposition. Dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov, Natan Sharansky, and many others faced years of confinement. Their treatment was often subtler than in the Stalinist years, but no less damaging. Solitary cells, constant surveillance, and psychological pressure replaced the open brutality of the Gulag. Meanwhile, ordinary criminal prisons developed their own subculture. The thieves-in-law maintained their influence, and prison slang spread across the Soviet Union, becoming a language known even outside the walls. For many young men, especially in poorer regions, prison became almost a rite of passage, a shadow institution parallel to society itself. Conditions varied. Some prisons were overcrowded and disease-ridden, little better than their Gulag predecessors. Others were comparatively controlled, with structured routines and stricter oversight. Yet the mark of Soviet incarceration was always the same: isolation, loss of freedom, and the constant reminder of the state's power over the individual. By the 1980s, under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union was crumbling under the weight of economic stagnation and political unrest. The prison system, though still vast, no longer stood at the center of society as it had under Stalin. Instead, it lingered as a relic, a reminder of decades of repression, even as the world outside demanded reform. The slow decline of Soviet prisons mirrored the decline of the state itself. As the Soviet Union approached its collapse in 1991, the empire of prisons remained, battered, transformed, but never fully dismantled. Its legacy, however, would continue to shape lives long after the iron bars rusted and the watchtowers fell silent. In the quiet expanse of history, where shadows fall across the 20th century, the story of women in the Soviet camps often remains in whispers. Their voices, though soft, carry a weight that time has not erased. Tonight, let us walk slowly into that world, not with alarm, but with gentleness, as if opening the pages of an old diary by candlelight. When the Gulag spread across the frozen landscapes of the Soviet Union, it did not spare anyone. Women, young and old, were carried away in the same trains as men. They were taken for their beliefs, their words, sometimes for nothing at all. And so, they too entered the realm of fences, towers, and endless labor. The life of a woman in the camp was marked by contrasts: strength and fragility, silence and resilience. Days were heavy with work, logging in the forests, sewing in dim barracks, carrying stones from one place to another. The body weakened under cold winds and hunger, but the spirit often sought secret spaces of survival. Some held on to songs from their childhood, humming softly under their breath. Others wrote verses on scraps of paper, hidden away, waiting to be remembered by someone, someday. In the barracks, nights brought a different challenge. Crowded bunks, the weight of exhaustion, and the absence of privacy made rest uneasy. Yet, in the stillness, women whispered stories to one another, stories of home, of family, of kitchens warm with bread, of gardens in spring. These words, shared in low voices, became a lifeline. For a few moments, the fences disappeared, and memory opened its wings. Among them were mothers, separated from children. Their longing was deep, like a river flowing silently under ice. They carried photographs, sometimes no more than a fading scrap of paper, touched until the edges wore thin. Others had no photographs at all, only the memory of small hands they once held. Dreams of reunion became a quiet prayer before sleep, even when hope was faint. Women also faced a burden often left unspoken: the gaze of guards, the imbalance of power, and the vulnerability of being seen as both prisoner and prey. These experiences were seldom shared aloud, yet they left marks that lingered long after release. Still, even in this shadowed space, bonds of solidarity emerged. Women helped one another mend clothes, shared crumbs of bread, or covered each other during illness. In this shared suffering, a kind of sisterhood was born. Some found ways to resist in silence: a stolen moment to braid hair neatly, a piece of fabric kept hidden to remind them of beauty, a small cross carved in wood. These gestures, so small, were acts of defiance against a system that sought to strip away identity. Each gesture said quietly, "I remain myself. I endure." There were also women who, after release, carried their stories into the world. They spoke not in anger, but with a quiet urgency, so the suffering would not vanish unremembered. Through their words, the silent suffering of thousands found a voice, echoing softly through time. And so, when we think of the Gulag, we must pause and listen for those whispers. The women in the camps lived lives marked by pain, but also by endurance that cannot be measured. They carried love for families they might never see again. They carried memories of freedom, folded carefully in the heart. And in that silent endurance, there was a strength that still glows, faint but unbroken, like a candle in endless night. Let us leave this chapter with a moment of stillness. Imagine a barrack in the frozen night, snow pressing softly against the wooden walls. Inside, a woman closes her eyes and hums a tune from long ago. Around her, others listen, drifting into uneasy dreams. The fences remain, but for a moment, in the sound of that gentle song, there is warmth, there is memory, there is the quiet strength of survival. Among the many silent chapters of the Gulag, perhaps none feels as fragile and as haunting as the story of children. In the frozen camps, behind fences and barbed wire, the laughter of childhood was almost unheard. Yet children were there, present, enduring, shaping memories in a place that seemed designed to erase innocence. Some were born in the camps, their first cry echoing inside wooden barracks rather than a family home. Their earliest memories were of cold winds slipping through cracks, of mothers rocking them on rough straw mattresses, of guards' footsteps outside the doors. For them, the world began not with open skies, but with fences. Childhood was measured by the rhythm of prison life. Other children arrived differently. They came with their mothers, arrested and sent away, too young to be left behind. Still others lived outside the fences, in nearby orphanages built for the sons and daughters of enemies of the state. Whether inside the camps or near them, the shadow of the Gulag pressed upon their young years. Food was scarce, and hunger became one of the earliest lessons. A crust of bread, hard and dry, was treasured as if it were gold. Children learned quickly to eat slowly, to make every crumb last. Play, too, took a different form. With no toys, they shaped figures from twigs or scraps of fabric, inventing games in the snow or dirt. Their imagination, though, remained bright. Even in such darkness, they found ways to dream. Mothers carried the heaviest weight. To keep a child alive in the camps was to struggle every single day, shielding them from harsh labor, bartering for food, finding warmth in winters that seemed endless. For many women, the thought of their children was the only force that gave them strength to endure another dawn. Yet separation was always near. When children grew older, they were often taken away to state orphanages, far from their mother's arms. That parting was a wound few ever healed. There are stories of children who remembered the camps with surprising clarity. They recalled the watchtowers, the dogs, the endless white of the snow. But they also remembered moments of tenderness, a lullaby sung quietly at night, an old woman sharing her scarf, a prisoner sketching little animals on a scrap of wood to make them smile. These fragments of kindness became anchors, preserving their sense of humanity. Some children, after leaving the camps, carried silence into adulthood. They rarely spoke of what they had seen, perhaps out of fear, perhaps to protect themselves from memories too heavy to bear. Others, much later, found words to describe their childhood behind barbed wire, giving history a softer but still aching voice. The presence of children in the Gulag revealed something deeper about survival. Even in the harshest conditions, life continued. A baby's cry in the night, a child's small hand clutching at a mother's coat. These were reminders that even in places built to crush hope, the future had not been erased. Children, in their very being, carried an unspoken defiance, a refusal of the world to end. Imagine now a quiet evening in one of those camps. Snow drifts slowly from the dark sky. Inside a barrack, a mother wraps her child in a thin blanket, whispering a bedtime story she once heard in her own childhood. The words are soft, almost a song. Outside, the fences stand tall, the towers loom, but in that gentle voice, the child drifts towards sleep. For a moment, the camp disappears, and the warmth of a story becomes a shield against the night. The children of the Gulag remind us that history is not only about power and politics, but about the smallest, most fragile lives caught within its tide. Their innocence was tested by hunger, by cold, by separation. Yet their memories, their very survival, remain as quiet proof that even in the darkest chapters, the flame of life continued to glow. In the story of the Gulag, the camps were only one part of a larger machinery. Before the trains, before the fences and the barracks, there were the long nights of interrogation. In quiet offices behind closed doors, the machinery of fear began to turn. It was not the loudest of terrors, but rather a slow, steady pressure. A person was summoned, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during the day, and led into a bare room. A desk, a chair, perhaps a dim lamp, papers stacked neatly, pens waiting. The silence was heavy, broken only by the scratching of pencils or the rustle of files. The atmosphere itself spoke. You are already caught. You are already small before something vast and unyielding. The interrogators were not always cruel in obvious ways. Sometimes they spoke softly, patiently, as if inviting confession were a gentle request. At other times, their words were sharp, repeated endlessly, day after day, until exhaustion settled like a weight upon the mind. Sleep was denied. Rest was taken away. Questions circled back upon themselves, weaving a net from which there seemed no escape. For many, the line between truth and confession blurred. The machinery of fear was designed not simply to find answers, but to break certainty itself. A person could be persuaded that silence was dangerous, that denial was useless, that the only path forward was to sign the paper laid before them. And so, confessions were written, sometimes real, often imagined, nearly always shaped by the pressure of endless questioning. There were stories of men and women holding out for days, for weeks, resisting with stubborn strength. Yet even the strongest body weakens without sleep, without food, under the steady weight of voices repeating the same demand: sign, confess, surrender. And slowly, even the most unshakable spirit began to bend. The interrogations did not need violence to achieve their purpose, though violence was never far away. More often, it was repetition that wore a person down. The same words, the same accusations, the same phrases written again and again in reports. The mind, trapped in this loop, began to lose its hold on time. Days and nights blurred. A week might feel like a single long evening under the same dim light. And when the confession was finally written, when the trembling hand signed a name at the bottom of the page, there was a strange quiet. Relief, perhaps, that the questioning would stop. Fear, too, of what would follow. Yet most of all, a numbness, like stepping into a shadow where thought itself grew still. For the state, the confession was not just a document. It was a key that opened the gates of the Gulag. With it, a sentence could be pronounced and another train could be filled. The machinery did not stop. It only moved forward, one confession after another. Looking back, one sees not only the harshness of these rooms, but also the fragility of those who sat inside them. Ordinary people, teachers, farmers, poets, workers, summoned into a space where the ground shifted beneath their feet. They entered with hope that truth might protect them, and left with words they never meant to speak, now bound to their names. The memory of these interrogations lingers softly, like the echo of footsteps in a long corridor. It reminds us how fear can be crafted not only with force, but with silence, with endless questions, with a slow erosion of certainty. And so, tonight, let us imagine one of those rooms, not as a place of torment, but as a fading image in the distance. A wooden chair sits empty. The lamp is turned low. Outside the window, snow drifts quietly through the dark. The voices have gone. The papers are stacked away. What remains is only silence, a silence that now belongs to history, no longer to the present. The machinery of fear was vast, but it too has passed. What endures is the memory of those who endured it, who walked into those rooms and emerged, however broken, still carrying within them the quiet dignity of survival. The Gulag was built to contain, to confine, to seal off hope behind walls of ice and iron. Yet within its vastness, whispers of escape drifted like secret winds. Few attempted it, fewer succeeded. Yet the very thought of breaking free became part of the silent resistance that lived in every prisoner's heart. To dream of escape was to dream of life beyond fences, beyond towers, beyond the endless snow. Prisoners would sit quietly at night, staring into the dark, and imagine the long road home. They pictured familiar streets, the sound of voices they once knew, the warmth of kitchens where bread baked slowly. These dreams were fragile, but they gave strength to those who held them. Some attempts were simple: a sudden run into the forest during labor, a leap across frozen rivers under the cover of storm. Others were carefully planned for weeks or months. Prisoners studied guard routines, counted steps between watchtowers, and waited for moments when shadows offered protection. Small groups sometimes formed, bound together by trust, by desperation, or by both. But the land itself was a wall. The Siberian wilderness stretched endless and unforgiving. Forests so deep that sunlight seemed lost among the branches. Winters so cold that the breath froze in midair. Hunger and frost chased escapees as fiercely as guards or dogs. Many who fled did not make it far, vanishing into the snow, their footsteps erased by storms. And yet, stories of survival exist. Tales of men and women who walked for weeks, guided by stars, drinking from rivers, finding food in the smallest of places. Some were sheltered by strangers, peasants who risked their own safety to offer bread or a warm fire. These rare successes became legends, whispered in barracks at night. Even if only 1 in 100 truly escaped, the stories spread hope among thousands. Resistance, too, did not always mean flight. There were other forms, quiet, subtle, hidden in daily life. A poem passed secretly from hand to hand. A carved figure shaped from wood in stolen minutes, kept as a charm against despair. A refusal to betray a friend, even when threatened. These small acts, invisible to the guards, were a kind of defiance. They reminded prisoners that their spirits were not fully contained. There were also moments of open courage. Hunger strikes, though rare, were remembered for their bravery. Some prisoners spoke words of protest during assemblies, knowing punishment would follow. Others kept journals, hidden away, with the hope that one day the world would know their truth. In this way, even silence became resistance, the choice not to surrender the self entirely. The legends of escape and resistance lived on long after the Gulag itself began to fade. They were told and retold, reshaped by memory, softened by time. Some may have grown larger than life, stories polished like stones carried in a pocket. Yet whether true in every detail or not, they carried something deeper. The reminder that even in places built to break the human spirit, sparks of freedom endured. Tonight, as we reflect, let us imagine one such legend. A winter night, the moon bright upon the snow. A prisoner slips quietly through the shadows, heart beating fast. Behind lies the camp, with its fences and towers. Ahead stretches the wilderness, dangerous, vast, but filled with possibility. Each step into the snow is uncertain, yet each step is also a choice, a declaration. I am still alive. I still seek freedom. Perhaps they made it. Perhaps the snow swallowed their path. In truth, the ending matters less than the act itself. For in the attempt, in the courage to rise against silence, the human spirit spoke. The Gulag was a world of fences, but it was never a world without hope. Escapes and resistance, whether real, whispered, or imagined, became threads of light in the long winter of imprisonment. They remind us, even now, that no system of fear can entirely silence the longing for freedom, nor erase the quiet strength that lives within the human soul. The story of Soviet prisons is not just about walls, wire, and watchtowers. It is about people, millions of them, whose lives were altered, broken, or transformed by a system that sought to control through fear. From the chaotic years after the revolution to the vast machinery of the Gulag, from the whispered defiance of poets to the silence of forgotten names, the history of these prisons is written in suffering, endurance, and memory. The Soviet prison system was more than punishment. It was a tool of power, a shadow government that shaped society both inside and outside its gates. Families were torn apart, communities scarred, and generations taught to live in fear of a midnight knock on the door. Yet at the same time, the voices that survived, in memoirs, in testimonies, in stories passed down, ensured that the truth would not vanish. Today, when we look back at that history, we see both a warning and a reminder a warning of how easily justice can be twisted into repression, and a reminder of the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming darkness. The prisons of the Soviet Union may have crumbled, but their echoes remain in literature, in memory, and in the lives of those who carry the scars. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let this story linger. Remember that history is not distant. It is lived, endured, and passed down. And in remembering, we keep alive the voices that were meant to be silenced. Thank you for listening. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with others. Your support keeps this channel alive and allows these stories to continue reaching new ears. Until next time, rest well and good night.